She entered the dining hall long before the trays could clatter into silence, or the trainees could muster the kind of bravado that belonged to the echoing walls of large rooms filled with bodies doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. She walked in as though she belonged to other orders of time, as though the day bent slightly around her arrival. The fluorescent lights overhead bounced off her hair in a way that made her silhouette sharper than the rest of the shadows in the room. The recruits didn't know what to make of it at first. They filed in row by row, trays held carefully chest high like shields, as if the day's sleeplessness might flicker a light inside them and show they were anything but tired. Air felt thicker than usual, with grit of exhaustion and impatience of young men and women strapped to futures that they had barely glimpsed but already dreaded around the corners. The table served as an altar of routine, and everyone here paid tribute to expectation. She paused in her movement and let her gaze cross the hall slowly, as though she were counting something invisible on each wall. The chatter hushed momentarily when she did this, not because someone ordered it, but because the room sensed her attention as though drawn to her like a magnet draws iron shavings. Her tray was plain white plastic, and metal cutlery lay next to it, unchanged by the buzzing fluorescent lights. Her meal sat unremarkably until someone nearest her swallowed a cough, and the noise stretched out long enough for the others to feel a tremor in their own bodies. They circled her slowly, unable to decide whether she was pretense or threat. The tallest of them stood first and reached out with a mocking grin as though he were snagging a rung of a ladder he thought he owned. He said something soft, but the syllables tangled and fell into silence as her head tipped only slightly. Her lips didn't move, but she didn't need to speak, because the silence inside the hall shifted when she met his eyes. That smile of his froze halfway and slipped away like a shadow made of ice. She didn't flinch. Instead, she simply waited like a cat perched high before its leap. The truths in that room were simple and brutal. They had come here to be broken and remade. They had come here because some part of them believed they could endure everything. And yet this woman had come uninvited to their arena, and thus the rules no longer felt safe. His hand hovered above her tray and lingered too long in that space of insolence. The other trainees glanced away or swallowed hard or pretended their trays were heavier than they were. They had practiced this posture, this grin, this bravado throughout the week. But now something in the room told them it was inadequate. Something thinner than courage, thinner than fear was wrapping around them quietly and tightening. 8 trays held by 8 trainees formed a semicircle around her table, and every movement pulsed like a heart beating faster than command allowed. A drip of water from somewhere behind the steel kitchen doors sounded louder than a gunshot in that hush. Her face remained still, not because she accepted their challenge, but because she considered it. She was tall enough to look them in the eye, and composed enough so they couldn't tell whether she weighed each one of them or dismissed them already. The tall one's eyes flitted sideways as though looking for reinforcements. The others watched. Him, as though waiting for a cue he didn't know how to give. Each second stretched, while the fluorescent lights hummed above them, and the trays looked like obstacles placed in a field of mines. He reached again, this time heavier and more certain, and the room exhaled in anticipation. She didn't shift, but the weight in her eyes collected something invisible like a debt waiting to be paid. The cutlery rattled on the tray when his fingers brushed her fork, and the sound rippled across the metal ceiling like a call to arms. The trainees leaned in slightly as though together they could tilt her into the ground and make her admission. You don't belong. There was a time in their training when they believed they were going to change the world. They believed they were invincible. They believed they were watched and recorded and sharpened into myth. But none of it had prepared them for this woman, and the quiet intensity that hung around her like fog. He drew back his hand and added words, this time his voice louder. He asked her what she was doing here, what section she was in. The hall felt bigger than it had moments before. The air cooled and the sound of trays sliding and boots tapping against tile slowed. They had rehearsed how to look confident, how to intimidate, how to dominate, but they had not rehearsed how to confront someone who didn't react. The tall one advanced one step forward, and his friends tensed as though ready to cover his back. He said her presence was unauthorized. He demanded she show her ID or leave. She looked at him steadily as though she weighed the difference between what he demanded and what he assumed. She stood up, finally sliding the tray aside without grasping it, as though she released something invisible. He did not expect her to stand, but she did. He looked at her full height, and something changed in that moment in the dining hall. The trainees shifted chairs, the scraping sound filling the small gap between fate and decision. The tall one's face twisted two ways at once, anger and uncertainty battling behind his eyes. The other six watched the standoff, waiting for the tall one's signal to act. They thought they had control, but they felt the ground under them tremble, faintly. Her hair caught the light, and for a moment all she saw were years of training, locked in muscle and mind and memory, that the trainees couldn't guess existed. The room didn't applaud, but it registered the change. The air became heavy, like a tidal wave that paused before a crash. She raised her hand slowly and pointed to the door behind them. The message was silent, but clear enough. He frowned, thinking she was signaling escape or challenge or surrender. He took a step toward her, and then paused as though the room held its breath. She tilted her head, and the lights above flickered slightly in their hum. She asked again who authorized her and what section she was in. The words were soft, but the power inside them resonated. Through the hall, the trainees gripped their trays tighter, their knuckles white, but the others looked at their hands as though they were no longer theirs. Before the tall one could answer, she reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out a card. The black portion of the card was chipped. The white letters reflected the lights. She didn't flash it vigorously. She didn't throw it, but she held it steady. The tall one leaned in to read it, and his grin vanished entirely as he recognized the letters. He didn't expect to know. He didn't want to know. The other trainees leaned forward too, and the room blurred for many of them as though they hadn't slept for days, but were trying to see something they hadn't been prepared to see. The card dropped from his hand before he even read the credentials fully. It clattered on the tray landing with a dull echo. The tall one swallowed hard, and for a moment the entire dining hall seemed to orbit around that small plastic card. He glanced at the rest of his group as though betrayed by them. The other six watched as though they were about to inherit some unknown fate. They had attacked a ghost, or perhaps a legend. They thought they found someone weaker. They thought they had found someone they could intimidate, but she wasn't intimidated. She stood there quietly, her chest calm, her posture loose, but ready. Her presence changed the geometry of the room. She was no longer part of the row. She was no longer just someone passing through. She belonged to the shadows between the lights, the space where intention meets action. The tall one swallowed again, and the hiss of the ventilation system sounded louder than the instructor's whistle that cut them last week. He asked her quietly, "Where are you assigned?" She didn't answer. She simply turned toward the kitchen door and walked slowly toward it. The trainees watched her back, and in that moment they realized how far away they were from the person they thought they could push around. One of the trainees dared to move before the rest. He tightened his grip on his tray and took a step toward her. The air pulled taut like a rope stretched across two poles. He snapped at her to stop, and she didn't turn. She didn't pick up her tray. She kept walking. The second trainee cried out, and the chairs scraped violently as the drift in the scene accelerated. The group closed off the path ahead of her as though trying to build a wall. The tall one barked that she was out of order, that she had no business here, that she was trespassing in the house of discipline. Her shoulders didn't flash tension. She passed by the segment of tables where the sprawl of trays and trainees watched each step she entered. The threshold of the kitchen door and paused. The metal frame of the door glinted. She looked at one of the younger trainees, the one whose eyes darted too fast, and said quietly, "You want to test me?" Then she started walking into the kitchen, and the door swung behind her slowly. The trainees found themselves frozen in the dining hall, their trays still held but forgotten, their breath shallow. The tall one pressed a hand to the wall behind him and tried to steady himself. The others looked at him, looked at her, and then at each other. In the corridor beyond the dining hall, they could hear something faint, a clang of pans, the soft thud of boots, the echo of voices. But the door muffled it all. The tall one glanced at his friends and the trainees around him. The trays felt heavier, the lights felt colder, and the pattern of their morning had broken. Its rhythm scattered into shards. They watched the door and waited, not because they expected her to come back, but because they feared she might never leave. Suddenly the door swung open again and she re-entered the hall. The gloaming of the kitchen lights spilled behind her, and she held one of the kitchen doors in her hand. The tall one lunged forward, but before he could reach her, she released the door and it swung closed and echoed in the hall like a signal of something changed. The trainees gasped before realizing they had gasped at all. The tall one's mouth hung open, and for a moment silence roamed the hall like a living thing. She faced them now with a calm they couldn't drown. Fire flickered in her eyes, but it was steady, like a flame fed by purpose, not passion. The tall one stuttered and then said, "Who are you?" She stepped forward, slowly, and the trays around them seemed to shrink into the floor. The others watched the lines on her jacket, the patch they hadn't noticed, the hardened lines of her boots, the subtle way they had been polished days ago and then battered again. They realized maybe she had been here longer than they imagined. Maybe she had walked this corridor when their names were still letters yet to be spoken. And then, without warning, she placed her tray on the table in front of her and folded her arms. She smiled just slightly. Her lips curved just so, and the room felt colder than before. The trainees leaned toward her as though drawn into something deeper than mischief. They wanted answers. They waited. She let them wait. The lights flickered overhead, and for the first time, the dining hall felt like a crucible, not a cafeteria. The difference between what they thought and what they now suspected hung between them like a rope about to snap. She then spoke softly, so that the room had to lean closer. The tall one cleared his throat, and the others waited with hungry curiosity and sudden dread. Her voice was steady and measured, as if each word carried weight. She said, "My name is Lieutenant Adler. I am on a temporary assignment to observe the training program." She paused, as though letting the implication settle. "This house you call your academy is under review." She watched their reactions, not their posture but the depth beneath it. The tall one opened his mouth, but she raised a hand, and the clatter of a chair dropping made the whole room flinch. She continued, and her next words held a promise of visibility and consequence. "Every action you take here will be logged. Every failure you conceal will be found. Your secrets will surface, and no one will be forgotten." The trainees shifted again. The trays in their hands felt like shields, but now shields that might crack. She held their eyes for a long moment as though counting them one by one, and the room exhaled a breath. It hadn't known. It was holding. Then she turned away and walked toward the exit of the hall. The door ahead welcomed her, but did not beckon. She paused in the threshold and looked back at them. She said, "This isn't a drill. It isn't a test of endurance alone. It's a test of character. You will find out which inside these walls as you go," and the door closed softly behind her. leaving the dining hall darker and quieter than it had been before. The trainees remained frozen, and the trays still in their arms felt heavy with expectation. They glanced at each other, confused, stunned, uncertain, as the ceiling lights hummed overhead. They sensed they had stepped into a new stage. They sensed that the woman they had mocked and circled had changed the game without raising her voice. They sensed the pattern of the day had shifted, and now all they could do was wait for what came next, and fear what it might ask of them. She moved before a single word could echo across the dining hall, and the trainees froze, as though time had split around her and landed on a new horizon. In an instant, the tall one's facade cracked, and he found himself staring at someone who didn't belong in a game he had already begun. Her step into their semicircle sent a ripple through the air, not loud or visible, but undeniable, like a silent drumbeat that made every chest tighten. The clip of boots on tile cut through the low hum of training banter, and even the wall-mounted speakers seemed to hush in deference to her. Presence. She did not raise her voice. She did not flare her nostrils. She simply exhaled once, and when the sound left her lips, the trainees felt a bolt of recognition ride the air. The tall one rigid-armed his fingers on the tray as though it might protect him, and his smirk vanished altogether, replaced by the quick blink of fear disguised in confusion. The other 6 watched their leader and held their trays as shields, though they realized absurdly that they protected nothing but themselves. Their eyes flicked between their own feet and her still figure, and for the first time they wondered whether this had begun with them or them with her. She surveyed them quietly, her gaze like a spotlight sweeping across a stage full of actors who didn't know the script. She paused on the shortest trainee, his shoulders slumped from fatigue and ego, the perfect pair of vulnerabilities. Her lips twitched into a faint curve and she said calmly, "I will ask you once. What is your name and what is your unit?" The young man's voice cracked before the words left his throat. He cleared his mouth and said, "I am trainee Austin Reyes, sir, and I am in Bravo Company Battalion 3. He lowered his gaze, but she held it until he raised it back and met her eyes. He said, "Sir," without pause, and the words sounded hollow and small in the cavernous room. She turned her attention to the tall one, and the measure of silence loaded the air between them. The tall one swallowed hard, his brain racing, while his chest rose and fell as though climbing an invisible slope. He said, "I'm trainee, Marcus Kane, Sir Company Alpha Battalion 1. Sir." She spat the last "sir," silently between his teeth. She nodded, and the next second she stepped soft, but with purpose, toward the tall one. Her footfalls were almost imperceptible, and yet the room sounded each one like a clock ticking in unnatural time. The tall one's friend stood still, but his eyes darted to corners of the room as though seeking allies that weren't there. He opened his mouth to reply, but the words stuck like gravel in his throat. Lieutenant Adler said, "Your actions 5 minutes ago will be on record. Your attitudes from here onward will be recorded. Your choices will be weighed, and your destiny as a leader or follower will begin here." She paused, and the sound of a tray shifting somewhere to their right startled everyone, and they flinched collectively as though struck by a bullet of possibility. The trainees looked at each other, then at her, then at their own trays, and realized that trays carried more than food now. They carried consequences. They carried tiny truths and flaws hidden behind training line after training line. She moved again and stepped past the tall one to where the other 5 trainees stood still and boxed in by uncertainty. Her voice dropped to a whisper, though the volume didn't change, the weight of her words did. She said, "Tell me who among you would take initiative in the face of chaos? Who would lead when the mission turns inside out? Who will do the thing no one wants because the thing no one wants is—" She paused, and the pause stretched like a blade across the hall. The trainees shifted. 6 gazes bent down, silent energy pulsed. The tall one shifted his weight but did not speak. The shortest looked at his tray, edging closer to the table rail, trying to find friction in it. Her eyes locked on him and she said, "The thing no one wants is the test of character." He looked at her, and then at his companions, and then at her again, and realized that leadership was not a badge, not a creed, but a moment of choice. Every second weighed. In that moment, the dining hall transformed from a place of eats and rests into an antechamber of consequence. The disbelief he felt was not for what she said, but for what she implied. That what happens in this room matters. Lieutenant Adler stepped back and raised one hand not to salute, but to signify. Pause. She looked each of them in the eye, and the lights overhead flickered momentarily, as though the electrical system recognized the shift. She said, "You will eat tonight, but this meal is not a dinner. This is a threshold. From this moment forward, you will be observed not just in drills, not just in mission rehearsals, but in moments like this when no one expects the spotlight and the hall is empty of applause." The tall one exhaled through his nose, and the other trainees sat down forcibly, their aerobic day turning into a theater of aftershocks. The chairs scraped and shuddered, and the full hall exhaled collectively, like a caught breath released. She extended a hand toward the entrance and motioned the tray-bearer to collect there. "Trays," she said. "Move everything away." And as they complied, the dining tables edged out of sight, and the engines of the hall, grounded in expectation and wires unseen, began to hum. The trainees exchanged glances and swapped silent questions. None dared ask aloud whether this was real or another test, but each knew in that moment they crossed a line. They scooped up trays and returned them to racks, placing them with mechanical precision, yet each placement felt as though they were sealing a pact. An invisible countdown began. Lieutenant Adler looked at the last tray slot and nodded. Then she said, "Follow me." The tall one pushed his tray rack away, and the others followed, though slowly. The corridor lights outside the dining hall glowed cold and harsh, and the kitchen door slid shut behind them. The ambiance changed. Her boots padlocked the tile corridor into a new rhythm. Her shadow stretched, and you could sense the hall they left behind still resonated with her words. She walked them to a nondescript door with an engraved label that read, "Observational Control Zone." The trainees paused their step, and the tall one raised an eyebrow, but she didn't break stride. She pressed the door open, and the soft hiss of conditioned air greeted them. The room inside was dimly lit with banks of monitors and flashing indicators, the hum of electronics whispering secrets in binary. The trainees looked at each other with renewed blankness, as though they had stepped into a machine built to analyze their every breath. She gestured to seats lined against a long console and said, "Sit down." The tall one eyed the seats, but his palms were damp, so he held his tray bag in his lap. The other trainees hesitated, but one by one they sat, and the monitors reflected their faces in dozens of tiny windows. The flicker of cameras behind tinted glass traced every move they had made earlier this morning, every moment of fatigue and tension during their drills. The screens glowed with data streams and icons, flashing like scoreboard lights. She pointed to one screen and said, "You see this feed? This is every move you made in today's entry into the hall." The tall one leaned forward and said, "What do you mean?" she said. "You moved in expectation of dominance. You expected a show of control. You assumed you could break someone who never asked to be broken, yet you failed in the simplest rule of this environment. You underestimated your opposition. Silence rose like steam, and the monitors glowed colder. The tall one's face paled, and the other trainees pressed their lips shut. Her next words pierced soft but sharp. "Every action you take here will be logged. Every decision you make will echo when you least suspect. Them who witness you are unseen. Yet present your integrity. If you believe you wear it is meaningless if you hide behind bravado. She paused, and the hum of computers became louder in their ears. Then another monitor flickered and came to life, showing the dining hall from earlier. Her figure entering their circle, their trays hovering in mid-air, the moment before her hand touched his shoulder. The tall one jerked back, and the memory burned in his mind as though magnified. His grin that morning looked foolish in the replay. In the cold glow of scrutiny, the record denied his version of the event and nullified his advantage. Lieutenant Adler leaned toward the console and pressed a key. The feed zoomed in to show her card dropped on the tray the moment their world tilted. She said that card isn't a prop. It's not a symbol. It's a designation of authority and competence. You may train for months here, but you will learn faster what happens when you don't know who you face. She switched screens again, and the trainees watched their images flipped and rewound and magnified. She said, some of you will lead, others will follow. Some will do both. But the question you must ask now is not who am I in this group, but who are you beneath the uniform? Who are you? When the trays clatter, when the lights hum, when the door closes behind you, and no one cheers. The tall one swallowed and said, I don't understand. Her eyes locked on his, and she said, then you will learn. You will learn to understand and to unlearn. You will learn to act when you are unseen and to accept consequences. You can't protest. You will learn the difference between confidence and control. The corridor beyond the control zone hummed with unseen traffic. The trainees felt a shift in their bodies, a readiness they did not know they possessed. She said, stand up and follow. Once more. They stood and walked out of the zone and back into the corridor. Their boots sounded heavier this time, and the air tasted like charged ozone. The group moved back to the dining hall door, and she paused at the threshold. She turned and looked each of them in the eye. She said, now you will dine in silence. The meal you eat will pass your lips, but not your thoughts. You will reflect on mistakes you have made today and the ones you will make tomorrow. They entered the hall again, and the rearranged room looked different. The tables gone, the chairs masked into corners, the fluorescent lights more relentless. The trays awaited them on a rack like instruments of penance. The tall one slid one tray out and placed it on the table, his hands steady though his mind raced. The others followed suit. The woman stood at the front and watched as they moved slowly, each one feeling the weight of every breath. She said, you may begin. And they did. The clatter of plastic and steel sounded like the start of some ritual. They ate in silence, their eyes downcast or fixed on the ceiling. The tall one's appetite vanished as he stared into his meal, seeing the card, the cameras, the footage, the moment he miscalculated. The other trainees chewed slowly and swallowed grudgingly. The food tasted bland as though washed in regret. As the meal dragged on, the lights overhead seemed to shrink and the walls closed in. Their silent chewing echoed in the hall, and each bite felt like an admission. They looked at the woman once or twice, but the look held distance. She did not invite questions. She did not answer them. She simply stood there like a sentinel holding them accountable. When the trays were empty, the tall one slid his across the table, and the others cleared theirs. Their movements were mechanical, yet every motion felt loaded with new meaning. She stepped forward and said, tonight you rest, but tomorrow you wake to something you did not expect. You will move at hours when you believe sleep will be deepest. You will act when you believe you will do nothing, and you will still be watched. The screens in the zone will not sleep. Your file will grow. Your decisions will expand your record. The trainees rose and gathered their bags, acids of worry in their stomachs. The tall one looked at the other five, and his eyes held questions unanswered. He swallowed again, and the hum of the hall felt louder than the scrape of boots. The woman turned to leave, and the lights flickered once as if affirming the consequence of the moment. She walked out and the door slid closed behind her. The trainees stood in the dimmed hall for moments that stretched. Like shadows in dusk, they released their bags and sat on the benches, confusion and clarity mingling. The tall one exhaled and whispered, "Are we even ready for this?" The others stared at him and at the door and at each other. No one answered. Deep silence filled the room. Then the ventilation hissed and the lights buzzed. The day of training ended, but something far greater began, as though a threshold had been crossed, and no one could find the sign of where the old world ended and the new world started. The trainees left the dining hall and walked toward their bunks, the echoes of the clip of her boots still ringing in their heads. The tall one glanced back once at the door and saw nothing change, but everything changed, and in the shadows of the dining hall behind them, the monitors in the control zone flickered and recorded everything they ever did there and everything they would do next. The door to the kitchen burst open and two instructors stormed in, their boots pounding, the tile like hammers falling in rhythm. The taller one had a clipboard, the other wore his cap pulled low over his eyes, but both moved like they knew exactly what had happened and exactly who was responsible without asking a single question. They looked once at the scene before them, bodies groaning on the floor, trays scattered across the dining hall, and the woman standing in the middle, not a hair out of place, not a breath wasted, just watching them all as if waiting for something or someone, or some silent cue only she could hear. The taller instructor nodded once, and then his eyes moved across each of the fallen trainees. He took no notes, but his mind was clearly calculating, assessing, cataloging what he saw one by one. He paused briefly at Marcus Kane, the tall one who had initiated it all, his wrist bent at an unnatural angle, sweat beading on his forehead, and a look in his eyes that teetered between pain and disbelief. The instructor said nothing, just turned his head slightly toward the woman and gave her a nod as though signaling a mission complete. None of the other recruits dared to speak. They remained frozen where they stood, some still holding their trays in midair. Others caught between retreat and surrender, their minds struggling to process what they had witnessed, because it wasn't just a fight, it wasn't a response, it was a message, sent with precision, sent with purpose, and yet none of them truly understood where she came from or why she was there. Until the clipboard officer reached into his back pocket and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly and looked at the recruits, then at her, then back to the recruits again. He read the paper quietly under his breath and then handed it to the other officer, who looked down and gave a low whistle, not of surprise, but of recognition. The name on the paper was one they had heard before, but never in a context like this, never within the walls of this training facility, and certainly not walking the same halls, eating from the same trays, training under the same lights as the rest of them. One of the instructors finally broke the silence and said to the room with a voice that didn't need to rise to be heard, "This woman is not part of your company, not part of your rotation, and not under the same rules you are. She is here under direct orders from the highest levels, and her presence here is not a coincidence. You were not supposed to know about her, not yet, but now you do, and now everything changes." He paused, letting his words settle over the group like a sheet of cold steel. They looked at her again, but now not as a stranger or an intruder, but as something entirely different, something that carried weight they could not measure with rank or posture or reputation. She had moved like no one they had ever seen. Her reactions were too fast, her control too complete, the way she had taken down Marcus and the others, without hesitation, without overreach, with just enough force to end things, and never more than that. It was surgical, it was terrifying, and it was familiar to those who had seen real combat. Marcus pushed himself upright, still cradling his wrist, his breathing shallow and his eyes narrowed, and he said almost in a whisper, You're not a recruit, are you? You're not even here to train, are you? And she turned her head slightly. Her eyes. Calm her body still, and she said, "No, I'm not. And you weren't supposed to know that not yet, but you made a choice, and choices have consequences, and now here we are." And he opened his mouth to speak again, but she was already turning toward the instructors, already moving on. The clipboard officer nodded again and spoke low this time, just to her. "The director wants a full debrief by 0600, she replied without hesitation. Already prepared, and she started walking past the rest of the recruits who instinctively parted to let her through like a current parting water. She did not look back. She did not slow down, and as the door closed behind her, the air seemed to collapse in on itself like the room was finally allowed to breathe. Again, without her in it. Later that night, the bunkhouse was silent, but no one slept, not really. Their bodies lay in beds. Their eyes stared at the ceiling, their minds turning over the same images again and again. The fight, the silence, the instructors. The card? The footage. They didn't want to believe it, but they knew what they had seen, and they knew enough to know that someone who moved like that didn't come from a standard unit. She came from somewhere deeper, somewhere darker, somewhere real. It was around midnight when one of the trainees couldn't take it anymore. He slipped out of bed and made his way down the hall toward the instructor offices. The lights were low and the halls echoed with each step. But he didn't stop, knocked twice on the door labeled Operations Control, and waited until it opened, and the night officer inside raised an eyebrow and said softly, "You're not supposed to be here." And the trainee said, "I know, but I need to ask who she is," and the officer didn't answer at first. He just looked at him long and hard, then stepped aside and motioned him in. Inside the room, monitors glowed with surveillance feeds, notes scrawled across whiteboards, dates, missions, training cycles. But in the center of the back wall, a single screen showed her file partially redacted even here, name unit history engagements all blurred out or blacked out, but one line remained visible. Naval Special Warfare Group, and under it another line, classified assignment. Status active. The officer didn't say anything else. He just watched the trainee's eyes widen as he read the screen over and over again, trying to absorb the weight of what he was seeing. Back in the bunkhouse, word spread quietly from bed to bed, from bunk to bunk. Not loud, not fast, but steady. And when the lights came on at 0500 and the instructors blew the morning whistle, no one moved quite the same. Their eyes were sharper, their posture tighter, and every trainee now carried a question in their mind. What else didn't they know? What else were they being tested on? And above all, what would happen the next time she appeared? The answer came faster than any of them expected. She returned that afternoon not in the dining hall, but on the obstacle course, wearing a plain shirt and regulation fatigues, no name patch, no rank insignia, and when the company was ordered to run the course again, she joined without a word, without a signal, just moved to the front of the line, and began running the course like it was muscle memory. Every rope climb, every wall vault, every dive through mud timed to perfection and executed without hesitation, and they all followed because they couldn't do anything else. Halfway through the run, Marcus found himself just behind her, his arm braced but functional, his breath ragged, and yet he kept pushing, kept following her through the course, watching her every move and wondering how someone could turn a training ground into a battlefield. Without drawing a weapon when they reached the last wall, she turned back just once and looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes that stopped him cold. Not anger, not pity, something colder and deeper. Recognition. When they finished the course, and the instructor barked orders again. No one looked at each other. They all looked at her and waited, and she said nothing. Just nodded once and walked back toward the armory, where she disappeared behind a steel door that locked behind her with a sound that felt final. But they knew it wasn't the end. Not yet, because the instructors no longer treated them the same, no longer gave the same briefings, no longer offered the same tired drills. Everything had shifted, and they knew it was because of her weeks past, and the rumors didn't stop. They only grew louder, stories of what she had done, of where she had served, of how many languages she spoke, of missions so classified. They didn't have names, only coordinates and code words, and yet through it all she remained a shadow, only appearing at precise moments, and always disappearing before the questions could catch up to her. The recruits stopped trying to guess, they stopped trying to challenge her, and instead, they started watching, learning, mimicking. Then one day she was gone, no warning, no farewell. The bed she used during night watch, stripped clean, her locker empty, not even a note. The instructors offered no explanation. The command center made no announcement, but the course of training changed again, harder, colder, faster. And now every challenge, every scenario, every moment was built around unpredictability and presence of mind, things she had demonstrated without explanation, and now they were expected to live by without question. It wasn't until 3 weeks later that the final piece arrived, when one of the instructors forgot to lock their desk and a folder slipped onto the floor. A recruit found it while delivering reports, and though he didn't mean to read it, his eyes couldn't help but see the heading Operational Observer Phase 2, and under it the name Adler S, and beneath that a stamped line that simply read, SEAL Team 6, Special Assignment Cleared, and the last line in handwritten ink written like a warning or a promise. Do not approach. Do not engage. Do not underestimate. He closed the folder slowly and returned it to the desk and said nothing. But that night, he told the others in whispers, and the story circled one last time, like a storm's final gust, and then silence, because now they knew for sure, and the knowing changed everything. They would never forget the woman in the dining hall, the one who stood against 7 with no backup, no badge, no weapon, only training and presence and something that could not be taught. And now every time a tray clattered or a recruit raised their voice or the lights flickered in the hallways, they remembered her and asked themselves silently, what would she do if she walked in again, and what would I do if I were the one standing in her place? And in that question they found the true training had only just begun.